Welcome everyone to another Zoomcast. It's the 30th of April, Thursday, and here in Canberra, we're getting some much needed rain. I'm a farmer now, and I always think it's rain. Rain is good. It's a whopping 6 degrees, so winter feels like it is here, and I'm sitting here in front of my very warm fire. I'm enjoying thinking about the prospect of our campus getting a little bit back to normal. Perhaps even some of us or most of us getting back to campus in the not too distant future. But unfortunately, COVID-19 is far from over. And while there's been optimistic reports of potential vaccines that are coming along quickly, therapeutic drugs perhaps to help us, I think we're still a long ways away from what I would call is the normal life that all of us, I think, kind of crave at this point. There's been now more than 3 million confirmed cases globally of COVID-19, and that number has doubled since the 9th of April. Here in Australia, we're doing much better with the cases slowing down to a trickle, and in the ACT, 106 cases. That's only grown by 3 in the last 2 weeks. So very encouraging. But I will warn you that things that exponentially grow can take you off guard very quickly. So we need to be very cautious in the coming weeks and months. And so I'm keen to get us back to campus, but we're going to do so consulting with our public health experts and the government as we make our decisions. So we will be cautious, and I am optimistic. So today I'm joined by Professor Andrew Norton, certainly one of Australia's most preeminent commentators on higher education policy. Andrew recently joined ANU in November last year, and he came to us from the Grattan Institute, where he ran their higher education program and published reports and analysis that had a lot of influence in the government and the sector more broadly. Andrew is a graduate of Monash University, has worked as a ministerial advisor and a media commentator, and in 2013, he co-led the Kemp-Norton Review into the demand-driven system by then Minister for Education, Christopher Pyne. So there's no one better placed to talk to me about the subject that affects everyone, staff and students. And at ANU, it really does affect the whole of what we do. And as we will hear, it really is a big part of the Australian economy. Almost 2.5% of our GDP is related to higher education. So welcome, Andrew. It's great to have you on board here at ANU. And it really is quite a time to be a higher education policy analyst, because I think for the first time in a long time, we're beginning to see an appetite for change, even if it is being forced upon us. So has the modern sector, from your perspective, ever seen such a period of uncertainty in your time here?
No, it's had nervous periods, particularly around big public policy changes, but never before have we seen a situation where one of our biggest sources of income, international students, is almost overnight sent into a huge crisis with no time to plan for that to happen. So it's going to cause enormous, hard to work out what the implications will be, but we know they'll be very, very big.
Yeah, so obviously the government, like everyone else, has its plans for the year, completely derailed by COVID-19. Now, they have responded with a package of policies for this sector. Perhaps you can summarize them. I'm fairly biased, as you might imagine, running a university.
Yeah, as your question indicated, I think universities are fairly disappointed with this package. There's only one element, which is waiving various regulatory fees that will definitely benefit every institution in the country, and not by very much. Probably the biggest part of it benefits the universities that are struggling with their domestic rather than the international student numbers. And that is partly due to overall weak demand. And it may also be because some students who have suddenly had to go online in ways they weren't expecting won't drop out, but might decide to drop subjects for this year and then try and do them again in subsequent years. So what the federal government is doing is basically guaranteeing previous tuition subsidies for those students and previous help loans for those students. And so that could be a few $100 million across the sector. They also announced some new short courses. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be particularly economic for universities to do. So possibly of slight assistance to the students, but not really a big gain to the sector. The other thing that some universities might get is access to the JobKeeper scheme. I know the University of Sydney intends to apply. This all depends on issues of timing, so that if there are particular months where, for example, international students are a very large percentage of a university's income, that may make them eligible for JobKeeper payments. But in my view, the vast majority of universities won't get that. And so really at the moment, they're having to work on cutting their costs rather than relying on government to give them additional assistance.
And so what do you think would happen if, for example, the University of Sydney, which is certainly one of the largest universities in Australia, were to, by a technicality, be able to get access to JobKeeper, and the rest of us are unable to do that? Do you think the government's just going to let that slide, or do you think they have enough means at their disposal to probably ensure it's all or nothing?
I think they'll probably let it slide, because we've got to remember that JobKeeper was not set up to benefit universities in particular. It's basically all organisations, for-profit, not-for-profit, charities on a special arrangement. And therefore, if they set the precedent of saying that we'll give it to all universities, that just creates a whole lot of other issues for other industries that they just won't want to deal with. So I guess one thing I'd say, though, is that even if Sydney does get JobKeeper, this doesn't really solve their problem. That, you know, they are facing a very significant multi-year decline in their revenues. And while they'd be obviously happy to get a bit of extra money between now and the end of September, that's not going to take away the need for some very difficult decisions.
I guess I don't, well, as I said, I was afraid you'd say that. So probably no silver bullet there for us. So, you know, we work in a very competitive international environment. What have been the policy responses in, I would say, some of our competing areas, Canada, the UK, but also the United States?
Yeah, so most, at this stage, as far as I can tell, most governments aren't being particularly generous to their universities. The United States did pass a $14 billion assistance package, about half of which was earmarked for payments to students. But if you divide that across a very big higher education sector in the United States, it's not really transformative. I had a quick look at some of their grants to universities, and many of them are sort of only getting sort of $5 to $20 million, depending on how big they are. And so again, it's like some of the things here, while you'll say yes to it for obvious reasons, but it's not transformative, and it still leaves enormous problems to be solved. And probably the big difference around the world is their general JobKeeper equivalence. Now, in Australia, all temporary migrants are excluded from eligibility from JobKeeper. So employers of international students and other temporary migrants can't get JobKeeper on their behalf. But in the UK and Canada and New Zealand, the equivalent schemes are allowing temporary migrants, including international students, to get it. And so that will mean that international students in those countries are in a better position, though not necessarily a safe position. For example, in New Zealand, only lasts for 3 months. And that may mean that there's a PR gain to those countries, that when the chips were down, New Zealand, UK, Canada treated international students more kindly than did Australia.
So there certainly is a lot of concern around our international students, and I know we feel that here at ANU. We've had a number of announcements, but not by the federal government, by state governments. Do you have a sense of what's going on there? It's quite unusual in some respects.
Yeah, and so Victoria this week announced the biggest of the packages so far, about $45 million, planning to pay, I think, $1,100 to each student who's in need or can demonstrate a loss of income, and also making them eligible for a broader rent relief package that's available to all people in Victoria. I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but the states have been competitive around international students for quite some years. They've been running their own recruitment schemes for international students on top of the national and institutional schemes. And so maybe Victoria is making a play here that, once this market gets going again, they want it to be known that Victoria was there for international students when times were tough. And so that may pay off in the long term for them.
And if we just think about our domestic students, what do you see? I mean, some of them, but not all of them, are eligible for job seeker, because we had a lot of our domestic students lose their job as well as our international students. But what I've seen certainly at ANU is that many of those students do not formally qualify for job seekers. So they're sort of, they're sort of in between, but yet they haven't been relying on family support. They've been living, pretty meagerly, too meagerly, it turns out, to qualify for job seekers. So what can we expect about domestic students? And do you expect domestic students to stay in higher education or leave it?
Look, I think one thing that's worth noting is that even though there are some domestic students falling through the cracks, overall, they are surprising winners out of the short-term responses to COVID-19. So youth allowance has been more than doubled effectively with an extra COVID-19 payment. And the flat JobKeeper payment of about $750 a week is roughly double what on average working students typically earn from their job. So they're actually in a pretty strong position. Unfortunately, that will all come crashing to an end at the end of September, and who knows what the consequences of that will be for them.
Hey, if you're getting more money, presumably, than you're used to.
Yeah, so that could be another issue. But I think domestic students this year, as indicated, some of them may reduce their study load because they're not happy with the online version of their courses. There's stories in the media today about performing arts students who don't believe they can actually do their course online, as a university is requiring them to do. But I think because, particularly if they're on youth allowance, you have to be a full-time student to get youth allowance. And so if they drop below 75% of their subjects, they will no longer be eligible for their income support. So there may be aspects of the support scheme which stop them dropping out when they might otherwise have done so.
Anything
I think in the long, sorry,
go ahead.
I think in the long run, I think the domestic student market, or the short to medium run at least, the domestic student market is probably the one bright spot for universities. I think there will be more demand for higher education, primarily due to the recession that we're already in due to COVID-19.
So if you were the minister's advisor, like you once were, anything else you think the government should be thinking about doing for the sector? I mean, we've talked about some of the issues with the international. Anything else you think that's appropriate right now to be doing?
Look, in the short term, I don't think there should be any general compensation for losses, because again, that would set a precedent that they don't want to set for other sectors. But I think there would be room for a more strategic examination of the consequences of potentially losing 10 or 20% of university revenue. Will there be research projects that are halfway through that will fall over without this money, wasting everything that's been done to date? Are there courses that are important to Australia that aren't viable without the international students being there? So not just a general handout, but thinking about, are there things we really want to keep, at least in the medium term, that would otherwise be lost if we just go along with a decline, which is hitting some universities much more than others, and therefore will have quite random effects on what courses we can offer in the country and what research projects we can get finished.
So let's think a little bit into the future. I mean, universities at one respect are one of Australia's great success stories. We've been very competitive in a strong international sector, but this sector itself is highly interconnected, and we have the entire geopolitical world being disrupted. And, I'm looking around, and conversations we'll have in the future is what's going to happen on that front. We seem to be skirmishing in a time when we need to be binding together, and it's not clear what's going to happen. So if you are thinking of 2022, because I'm really worried about 2021, What are the types of things that we as a university, ANU, should be thinking about, and more broadly, the university sector, about the new normal that's going to emerge in the years to come?
So I think we need to think about how we're going to meet the needs of domestic students. I believe there will be a spike in demand next year for various reasons, and that will inevitably have consequences for the next few years, because once you take a first year, you've got them for second and third year. Then we have to think, I think, a few years into the future of that in the mid-2020s, where there's a big baby boom coming through the school system now, and we need to start getting ready for them. Maybe we'll have some spare capacity without the international students there, so we might have the classrooms for them. But nevertheless, we need to really get ready for them and persuade the government that they're really going to trigger another social crisis if we let a large part of a cohort miss out on higher education, which is effectively what's going to happen on current policy settings. We probably need to look at
Sorry, go ahead.
need to look again, I think, at the way research is funded. So we've partly because we've had this discretionary income from international students, we've had this system where universities can sign up to government research projects which don't cover the full cost of the research, and the government and universities have gone along with that because it actually has been possible to finance these projects. But without international students, that won't be the case anymore. And so there'll be real questions about whether all universities can even afford to apply for the Australian Research Council on National Health and Medical Research grants, which would seriously undermine the whole research system if they couldn't do that.
Well, I'm certainly thinking very hard about that nexus between teaching and research, which is, of course, the core of the ANU mission. And to my mind, this is a chance to think beyond universities through CSIRO, through businesses, to rethink the whole way we do research in Australia and try to fix some of the shortcomings that have developed over the last 15 years. We're very good at certain things, not very good at involving business and trying to figure out some ways around that. This strikes me as perhaps one of the things I'm going to be focusing on with the government in the weeks, months, and years to come. Hopefully that seems like a sensible idea to you.
I think the government will agree with you, and there have been a number of policies around this over the last 20 or 30 years. It's one of those things where the results always seem disappointing, and so I think we've probably not yet got the relationship exactly right. I think universities and businesses have different kinds of purposes, and meshing those two in a project is often quite difficult.
Yeah, and that's why I think it actually has to be. I mean, I think we need to continue to advocate for the fundamental research we do and uniquely do, and then think a little bit more about how we link into the needs of business and create essentially a bunch of R&D intensive businesses in this country, which seem to be lacking. And it's kind of hard to have conversations with two institutions that are completely disconnected in actually what they care about. So my hope is we can make some progress on that. So as we finish up, I want us to look ahead to a time when the world is more back to normal and we can do once again all the things we used to take for granted. Post-COVID-19, what are you most looking forward to doing that you can't do now?
I think what periods of isolation reveal are the small pleasures in daily life. Going to the office, seeing people, going to restaurants, all these things. So I don't think it's anything spectacular. It's just, in some ways, it's a useful reminder that there is actually a lot to enjoy in your daily routines that you can't do when you're essentially in COVID-19 home detention.
All right. Well, on that note, Andrew, thank you very much. I look forward to catching up in person sometime. It may be several months or even a year away, I don't know. But this is a really important time for ANU and for the higher education sector more broadly, and I really appreciate your insights, and we very much appreciate having you here at ANU, helping drive a national conversation about the importance of, as you noted, one of Australia's most important sectors, Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.